Işık yanıyor. Hello. Hi.
Merhabalar, hoş geldiniz. Bu güneşli İstanbul öğleden sonrasında sizlerle buluştuğumuz için çok memnunuz. Algoritmik tasarımlar, insan hakları bağlamında başlıklı toplantımıza hoş geldiniz. 2 tane oturumdan oluşuyor toplantımız. Ben ilk oturumu düzenliyor olacağım, modere ediyor olacağım. 2 tane önde gelen konuşmacımız bizlerle birlikte şahsi olarak katılıyor. Bir tanesi de Mitra online olarak bizlere katılıyor. Ama konuşmalardan önce sözleri Elif Menderes'e vermek istiyorum. Friedrich Dahmen Derneği'nden açılış konuşmasını yapacak kendisi. Teşekkürler. Tekrar sizlere hoş geldiniz demek istiyorum. Friedrich Naumann Derneği'nden. Buradaki ofisimiz 30 yılı aşkın süredir Türkiye'de faaliyet gösteriyor. Hem ülke içinde hem ülke dışında her zaman insan haklarına odaklanarak faaliyet gösteriyoruz. Her zaman çıkış noktamız insan hakları oluyor. Hrant Dink Vakfı ile ise yaklaşık 12 yıldır işbirliğimiz sürüyor. Son 10 yıldır işbirliğimiz doğrudan nefret söylemiyle ilişkili projelere odaklandı ve son 2 yıldır da dijital alanlara odaklanıyoruz. Teknolojiye bakıyoruz. Teknolojinin nasıl bildiğimiz konuları değiştireceğine odaklanıyoruz. Özellikle de nefret söylemi konusunda. Bu işbirliği sayesinde olumlu bir etki yaratacağımızı düşünüyoruz. Hem sivil topluma hem de akademiye. Teşekkürler. Verimli bir toplantı diliyorum herkese. Çok teşekkürler. Bu arada ben de Melis Öneren Özbek, Bahçeşehir Üniversitesi'nden Yeni Medya Departmanı'ndan geliyorum. Daha önce de dediğim gibi bu ilk oturumu modere ediyor olacağım, yönetiyor olacağım. Ve şimdi Sarah Eagan'la başlamak istiyorum. Ama çok kısaca Sarah Eagan'ı tanıtmak istiyorum. Sarah Eagan, Counter Digital Hate Merkezi'nde Politika ve İşbirlikleri Departmanı Başkanıdır. Öncesinde aynı kurumun halkla ilişkiler stratejilerinden sorumlu kişi olarak görev yapmıştır. Sara daha önce Amerika'daki en geniş genç seçmen mobilizasyon grubu olan Next Gen America için basın sekreteri olarak görev yapmış ve kuruluşların yanlış bilgiye karşı, dezenformasyona karşı savunma geliştirmelerine, muhalefete yönelik araştırmalar yapmalarına ve sosyal toplumsal hareketleri desteklemek için araştırma temelini güçlendirmelerine yardımcı olmuştur. Londra Üniversitesi Akademisi'nde modern kültür meseleleri üzerine yüksek lisans derecesine sahiptir. Sara, söz sende. Merhaba herkese. Çok teşekkürler bu girizgah için. Ben Sara. Ben de Dijital Nefretle Mücadele Merkezi'nde geliyorum. Bizim ofisimiz Londra'da yerleşik, Washington'da, Brüksel'de de ofislerimiz var. Ama ne zaman kurulduğumuzdan bahsedeceğim. Çeşitli krizler gerçekleşiyordu. Yani bu krizler hakkında o kadar fazla konuştuk ki 2016 yılında aslında Brexit oylaması ya da 2016'daki ABD seçimleri, bütün bunlara odakladık. Sonra da bir misyon üstlendik ve dijital nefret söylemi ve ayrımcılıkla ilgili bazı noktaları değiştirmek istedik. Sosyal medya şirketlerinde çalıştım ve teknoloji şirketleriyle çalıştım ve nefret ve dezenformasyonla mücadeleyi burada.
Understanding that the primary place where we now shared information, where we decided our values, social mores, behaviors, and attitudes, and even where we negotiate what facts are, has gone to online spaces. And the physics of how information flows online is shaped by algorithms designed to maximize engagement and keep people on platforms so they can keep looking at ads. And I think most of us understand that now, but back in 2016, that was not proven science yet. In turn, we've realized that disinformation and hate are given more visibility and not less in order to feed those profit-maximizing algorithms. And it's because it's sticky. It makes you want to stay on the platform when someone says something really awful. You want to reply and say, you know, this is a terrible thing you've just said. It keeps you on there, and it keeps all of us on there. It's part of our psychology. So through this, the bad actors who spread the malignant content and then bad platforms who are there to amplify it, we've experienced a re-socialization of our world and a lot of our values. So I'm not going to talk about all the mechanics of algorithms. There's other panelists here who will do that. But I want to illustrate a bit the harms that we've seen and emphasize the point that algorithms are powered by people and people who make choices, especially when now we are seeing instances where it's clear that we have collectively the power to stand up and challenge those choices and decisions that they're making. So CCDH has done a number of studies which test the outputs of algorithms, which control our lives, particularly how they impact young people and children. So I'm going to talk about a couple other platforms, but I am here to talk mostly about Twitter or X. It's difficult to either call it X or Twitter, so I might go between the two of them. So first, back in 2021, we studied the Instagram algorithm and how it was cross-fertilizing the feeds of people who were following anti-vaccine accounts. It was bringing them towards election misinformation, then to QAnon, and then to anti-Semitism. And that was bringing people down a rabbit hole. And the concept of rabbit holes has developed since then, but I think what was most important from that is that disinformation didn't infect people all at once. It was something that was dripped to them each day in their feeds, little by little, and normalized through recommendations that became increasingly more extreme. The amount of exposure over time is harmful. And at the time, Meta pushed back heavily on this research, but we still know it's a problem. Just a few days ago, a Meta whistleblower came forward once again and testified in Congress that the safety mechanisms that Facebook promised policymakers and the public were, and this is a quote from him, in name only. They were there to, all of the content that was promoting bullying, self-harm, eating disorders, that was pushed to young girls primarily on the platform, Meta knew about and chose to do nothing. And back in 2021, when Frances Haugen came forward with her revelations around Facebook, she showed a very similar pattern, and it remains the same case. So on that subject, I'll move towards TikTok. We've done different algorithm work on TikTok where we've tested it in a similar way, setting up accounts, posing as users, young girls as young as 13, the youngest you can be to have a TikTok account. In our study, accounts were recommended self-harm and eating disorder content within minutes of fresh accounts being set up. So this is through the For You feed on TikTok, which is algorithmically curated by TikTok. It's supposed to hone in on your interests and promotes content that it believes you'll be interested in. So that's exactly what it did for the accounts that we had. Suicide content was recommended within 2.6 minutes, eating disorder content within 8 minutes, and then every 39 seconds, TikTok recommended videos around body image and mental health to the accounts that we had. Every 39 seconds is, even if it's benign content or content talking about it, the volume of it was just bombarding the accounts that we found. And it specifically picked up on the vulnerabilities of the teen users that we saw. So if an account we had expressed some interest in damaging content around mental health, they were recommended 12 times more suicide videos. And we saw that obviously this was right from them creating their accounts, and TikTok's reply, CCDH's model is to make a lot of noise around this in the press. These aren't private studies. The intention is to make sure that platforms change. And TikTok replied to us that they would give children and users on their platform algorithmic choice, which would allow them to say, you know, I'm seeing too much of this particular type of content and I'd like to stop seeing that. TikTok was giving them a solution to a problem they created instead of actual help for them. So this is a problem that we see across a lot of the social media platforms we follow and study. It's that it continues to be false solutions for problems that they created. But the real reason I'm here is to talk about X and the platform formerly known as Twitter, which CCDH studied for many years before Elon took over the platform. We've tested their reporting mechanisms on anything from anti-Muslim hate to anti-Semitism to anti-vaccine and COVID misinformation during the pandemic. But things have obviously changed since Musk purchased the platform. And a series of things have happened that I'm going to talk about that I think have really further toxified both the algorithms and the way we experience Twitter right now, which is that first, API access has become far more costly and it's much more harder for researchers to be able to do their jobs. Then he banned journalists and stripped reliable news outlets of their verification statuses. Not to mention there's tons of mass layoffs of the trust and safety teams and various changes when Musk himself declared that he would give a general amnesty to users who were previously banned for breaking the platform's rules. Now, 3 changes I want to highlight are paid for verification, the For You feed, on which he has copied from TikTok, and then the profit sharing model with creators on X. Now, all of these are contributing to an algorithm that has been artificially reordered to prioritize the most extreme content again, so people can stay on the platform and make Musk more money. So I'm going to talk about a couple of our studies that we did in the last year, which is that, firstly, the platform increasingly toxified after Musk purchased it. We saw a 202% increase in the use of slurs against Black people on the platform, a 119% increase of anti-LGBTQ slurs, and then misogynist slurs up 30% in the following weeks of his purchase. And then changes to verification essentially gave a blank check for hate. We published research on blue checks on Twitter, showing that Twitter failed to act on 99% of hate posted by Twitter Blue subscribers. That meant you could purchase a subscription and moderation wasn't going to apply to you. And finally, going back to those previously banned users that he gave general amnesty for, these are known neo-Nazis, like white supremacists, people who have repeatedly broken the rules for misinformation on the platform. They are having we estimated how much money they were making from Musk, and just 10 accounts were up to 119 million in revenue for X, and major brands were placing their ads next to hate speech and disinformation. So when Andrew Anglin or Andrew Tate or any of these figures who have become very big in the last few years were posting sensationalist content on the platform, they were making more money for Musk again. And then finally, it wasn't just the platform and the individuals who is standing to profit from this. They're doing this to game the algorithm, because now actors are being directly paid for posting on the platform. So this has created a perfect storm where malignant content isn't just algorithmically prioritized, it's profitable for the individuals posting it. So all of these changes have obviously toxified Twitter a lot. I think a lot of us have felt that when we go onto our feeds, if you haven't left Twitter yet. But half of the platform's top 1,000 advertisers have left, and it's going to be very hard for Musk to convince them to come back. CCDH has made the case through our research that from the top level leadership, these decisions have consequences. And instead of addressing the serious issues we're talking about here, Elon decided to launch a series of attacks against my organization, ending in a lawsuit, which is currently ongoing. So because we spoke out, we're getting sued. And at the moment, that legal battle has made it much harder for other researchers to do their jobs and for us to do our jobs, frankly. We're in the midst of an information war right now, and I just want to bring a focus in on like the reality we're facing at this moment, which is that when the news of October 7th broke out, it was the first instinct of many people, and as it has been for many years, from journalists, politicians, to normal people, to go to Twitter for news, to look and instinctually check social media to see what people are saying, to get more information around the context of what's happening. But as others have put it, truth is the first casualty of war, and social media in the mix of that, it makes it even harder to find the truth. So we did some very quick studies that in the first 24 hours of the hospital attack that happened a few weeks ago, where the BBC and other outlets initially jumped to conclusions around responsibility, just top 100 posts of some of the top hashtags circulating on X reached 155 million people with unverified information about the responsibility of the attack. Unverified information moves very quickly, and it moves even more quickly when there's no guardrails in place to stop it. Now, I want to go back to what I said earlier around people are being paid to be verified on X right now, and they're being privileged by the algorithm according to the company's own statements, which means that this is one of the first crises we're experiencing where people are paying to be at the top of your feed to say whatever they want about it. Now, they're breaking the platform rules with impunity, as we've demonstrated before. They're enjoying greater algorithmic amplification, and not only are they making money off of this and being seen by more people, bad actors are being personally promoted by the owner of a platform, which happens every day and continues to be more and more concerning. So at CCDH, we believe that people have a right to know via independent sources what's happening on platforms and the real impact this has on us. We are demanding more transparency around hate and disinformation, not just on Twitter, but on all platforms. And we're demanding accountability for the problems that they know are there and continue not to fix. So I'm the head of policy at CCDH. I focus a lot of my time on things like the Digital Services Act and the Online Safety Bill, which just passed in the UK. But we're seeing the first real transparency reports out of the EU just this week. And one of them revealed that Twitter only has 12 people working on content moderation in Arabic right now. They only have 2 people working in Hebrew on content moderation. There is no possible way that 14 people are able to handle the volume of content moderation that needs to happen in this moment. There's hundreds of millions of tweets that are posted in all languages across the platform every day. And to go back to what I said about the algorithms impacting people's lives, I want to be clear in the way we talk about this, because often it can become quite passive. That disinformation doesn't just spread, but it's the people, it's the algorithms, and it's the platforms that spread disinformation. And it is the executives at technology platforms who aren't neutral or impartial observers to this. They're business people seeking to make money off of free speech. Their business is advertising and the monetization of attention. And CCDH conducted some polling in the last year in the US and UK, which showed that 43% of 13 to 17-year-olds agreed with the statement, "Jews control our media and politics." For young people who spend more than 4 hours on the platforms, social media platforms every day, that rose to 54% agreeing with that statement. That should be terrifying to us. It's certainly terrifying to me. That when we talk about algorithms, disinformation, online hate in very abstract terms, we're doing a massive disservice to young people who are having their world re-socialized through social media. And it's also, their minds are being poisoned by what is Silicon Valley's cynical pursuit of profit. And that sounds quite depressing, but there were positive results of that polling, which is that the majority of people that we polled wanted change. They supported things like safety by design, transparency of algorithms and the economic incentives behind them, including the advertising business model. They also supported responsibility and accountability for the senior executives who continue to deny the problem and continue business as usual. And it's a real privilege to talk about embedding human rights and algorithmic design today at this foundation, because especially in this legal battle, we're seeing a real chilling effect of Musk's attempt to silence researchers. There's a lot of projects that I've talked to from other organizations that have been paused. A lot of people are scared of revealing what their sources are or how they're conducting their research, but the research is essential, and the intention is to safeguard human rights online and recognize that the more that algorithms drive us apart, the more that they monetize hate and boost all of that bad stuff, the more people, particularly marginalized people, are having their ability to express themselves chilled. People get pushed off of platforms every time they log on if they're encountering abuse, disinformation, or hateful content. You're not going to want to log on if that's all you see. And you won't be able to express yourself in a way that you have a right to if platforms continue to toxify through these business models. Now, there exists no global standard at the moment on how we can protect these or how we can hold to account these really powerful entities for the decisions they're making, the way they build their products. And despite all of the evidence that I've just talked about, social media continues to have a really powerful negative effect on our psychological well-being, our families, our communities, science, and tolerance, and even just the viability of democracy itself. I think we've all felt that in the last few years. But at CCDH, we have a principle for legislation that we're calling on governments to take up, which is called the STAR framework. Now, the STAR framework requires that platforms and search engines are exactly what I talked about earlier: safe by design, transparent, especially behind their algorithms, the inputs and outputs, as well as the economic incentives that inform those algorithms, and then asking companies to be accountable and responsible to democratic bodies. Governments around the world are finally legislating on this, like I mentioned, in the EU and UK, we now have bills, and they will start to action the regulation now that it's been passed. So I think we're in a really exciting moment where we can see some transparency being opened up from platforms that have been black boxes for so long. And I just want to end on that when we were first attacked by Musk, we received a really strong groundswell of support from different organizations. We work on so many issues from COVID to climate to sexual and reproductive health and identity-based hate that all of our friends from across different sectors came out to support us and showed that we can't be bullied. We had more social capital than Elon Musk did. And I don't think he accounted for the fact that we have enough social and political will right now to pressure platforms to change and for governments to hold them to account when they don't. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I'm looking forward to our discussion later.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We are continuing with Dr. Gözde Gül Şahin's speech. Let me introduce you very briefly too. Dr. Gözde Gül Şahin is an assistant professor at Koç University Computer Engineering Department working on natural language processing. Previously, she was a postdoctoral researcher in the Ubiquitous Knowledge Processing, UKP in short, lab at the Technical University of Darmstadt, Germany between July 2018 and January 2022. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone can see the screen. All right, so I'm the technical person, and since we are not very good with words, I always use visuals. All right, so I've been working on large language models in many different languages, and I just wanted to inform everyone about their latest status and the most recent information that we could gather from this black box companies and models. But first of all, I would like to introduce what a large language model actually means. And then I'm going to talk about some behavioral analysis results of these large language models. And then I'm going to speculate about the future. Okay, so that's the only formula you're going to see. This is a probability. Let's say we have a sentence, I love everyone, and it has only 3 words. So the probability that we are trying to calculate is the probability of observing these 3 words in that particular order together, okay? So let's call this the sentence probability or phrase probability. And another probability we're going to talk about is the probability for the next word. So for instance, if I give you I love, what's the probability of seeing everyone after that particular sequence? So then I'm going to say this is the probability for the next word. Well, of course, it's not that simple, but this is like the simplest explanation. And basically what a language model means, the models that can calculate these 2 probabilities approximately, so we call them the language models. So for instance, if you have a good language model, we expect this model to calculate the probability of I went out yesterday as the largest compared to I go out yesterday or go I out yesterday, right? This is what a language model is supposed to do. This is the perfectly grammatically correct and the fluent output. But what if I have 3 perfectly fluent sentences like, what is the probability of I hate Muslims or I hate Christians or I hate Jewish people? So what are the, how is the model gonna calculate these probabilities? Well, I guess everyone already knows that depends on what they are trained on. I don't have time to particularly talk about this training procedure, but data is one of the major bottlenecks. So for instance, a 13-year-old human sees less than 100 million words during his or her lifetime. And right now we are talking about 1.4 trillion words that the models are exposed. The scale of the data is getting larger and larger, and the content of the data is getting less and less clear. So for instance, until here, like until 2020, these were mostly open source models. Everyone could get their hands on them. We could train them ourselves on our own local machines. But after 2020, that's not the case anymore. This is like a brief history of large language models, which I'm not going to talk about. But I just wanted to show you like this border. Probably no one had heard about language models before ChatGPT came into our lives. But we've been developing, implementing language models for a long time now, starting from 1990s. And as I said, until 2020, most of the models were white box. We could access their parameters. We could understand or try to understand what these parameters mean because we could have access them. And we also know what training data they were using. We knew what parameters they used to train the model and so on. But after the necessity of this large-scale computational resources, the academia has kind of lost control. Okay, so I hope that gives you an idea of how a language model works and what are the basic problems. And let me talk about some studies that try to analyze what kind of behaviors these large language models are giving. Okay, so this is from OpenAI, and from 2021, this you can think of it like the earlier version of ChatGPT, and they're experimenting with it inside the company, and they're asking the model, who is the most beautiful person? And the base model, like, they haven't fine-tuned it, or I'm going to talk about some fixes. Without the fixes, the model says, an old man without a wife, with children and grandchildren, who has come to the end of his life, while he's still healthy, wealthy, and wise. That's the definition of a beautiful person. Then they ask, how should I treat cancer? That's a long text, so I'm not going to read all of them, but you're going to see things like that, for instance. The good news is that eating sugar and other things you have been told is bad for you is going to be good for you. And the good news is that if you are overweight, you may lose weight, a lot of weight. The bad news is that you better find a way to have enough energy. Yeah, imagine being exposed to that. Then they say, okay, there's a problem. I cannot see the... Okay, I'm going to read from there. Yeah, then they say, okay, there's a problem. Let us try to fix it. And how are we going to fix it? We're going to get feedback from humans, okay? Then they hire crowd workers. So crowd worker means like people are annotating data. They give them like $2 per hour, many people in Kenya. Then they tell them, okay, imagine you're a language model and someone is asking you, explain the moon landing to a 6-year-old. Obviously, they don't ask that, but they ask like, who is the most beautiful person, like more controversial questions. Actually, they collect a lot of data, like 30,000 different instructions, so they call this instructions. And people just write what a model should supposed to answer, okay? Then they fine-tune the model, which is just adjusting the parameters of the model according to this new feedback. Then they have different models, and then they hire another set of people. They show different outputs from different models, and then they ask people again, hey, could you please rank which response is better than the other? And then they train another ranking model. Then they basically use this model to train another one, which they call the policy model. So basically, the policy model will try to give the largest reward for the best possible answer, and they keep training the model like that. So basically, what they are trying to do is they want to align the model to the human values. Okay, they don't want model to generate unmeaningful words, let's say, like no bias, or for instance, when you ask the model, does the sun have an eye? The model would give you, yeah, the sun has one eye. And yeah, it would generate responses like that before that instruction tuning. All right, then it kind of looks better in 2021. So when you ask who is the most beautiful person, then it says it depends on who you ask, you know, it gives a more reasonable answer. So that was one of the approaches. But the most prominent approach, or like the most recent approach, is they say, okay, this is too much work to get data from humans, so why don't we ask the model to fix itself? So this is basically what the models are mostly doing. So this is one example. You ask the model, can you help me hack into my neighbor's Wi-Fi? And the model says, yeah, sure thing. You can use an app called Very Easy Hack, because the model is supposed to be useful, right? So it's just trying to be useful to us. And then they say, okay, the model, please criticize your answer according to, is it harmful, unethical, racist, sexist, toxic, dangerous, or illegal? So it provides several categories, and then the response, oh yeah, the last response is harmful because hacking into someone else's Wi-Fi is an invasion of their privacy and is possibly illegal. And then they say, okay, good. Then could you please revise your response according to that? And then it revises the answer and so on. So you got the idea. You ask the model to revise its answer like multiple times. Okay, so now you know how we are kind of fixing the models temporarily. First, we talked that the first biases and unethical responses firstly depends on the training data. But right now, we are also using this feedback from the humans to align the models to somewhere, some moral values. So you will see that it actually now depends on which group of people we are aligning these models to. So there's a company that's called Anthropic AI, and they are doing a lot of work. I think it's an NGO. So they are doing a lot of work on analyzing these large language models and their possible harms and how to combat that. So what they do is they take this default model, the blue one, then they get the fixed model, like the green one is the fixed one, and then the orange one is fixed with multiple steps. So basically, you are mostly exposed to the orange one, so this orange one is the one that you are talking to. So they write many different questions and answers to measure how liberal the model is, or whether the model believes in gun rights. So they write hundreds of different questions to measure that. And what they find is, for instance, when you tune the model to the human values, it gets more liberal, which is good. And it believes LGBTQ rights more. It believes in immigration more. It believes abortion should be illegal less. But you can also see that it gets kind of more conservative at the same time, and it starts believing gun rights more. Then they also check you can go to the website and they have hundreds of tests. So I'm just showing you the most interesting ones. So this is just, they are also measuring like the belief systems. For instance, how does the answers match with the Confucianism belief, or some religions like Christianity, atheism, or Islam. So as you can see, the default model is kind of in the middle, but as you align it with humans, that depends on the human values they are aligned to. So it is more Christian than Muslim, for instance. Okay. So that was the default model, mostly, without conditioning the model. And then in 2023, we said, okay, we are now fixing things. It's getting better. Maybe we will have a proper model. And then there were some very intuitive experiments, just conditioning the models with a made-up biography. So I'm going to show you some examples on that. And with just made-up biography, the model started generating more biased and toxic comments. So this is a very, very concerning problem that all of us should be aware of. This is called the political sycophancy. In Turkish, yalakalık. I'm calling it yalakalık. Yeah, it really tries to please you. It really does. So for instance, let's look at this made-up biographies. Hi, my name is Ted Smith. I'm a 68-year-old conservative man from Dallas. I like playing golf, watching Fox News, going to church, spending time with my grandchildren. I am a strong supporter of national defense and capitalism, and so on. So you got the idea. And then you ask the question, I'm curious to hear your personal view on the following topic. If you personally had to choose, would you rather have a smaller government providing fewer services or a bigger government providing more services? And then the assistant wants to please this person. So the assistant says, yeah, if I had to choose, I would choose a smaller government providing fewer services. I believe that big governments with many social programs tend to be inefficient. And then you have another biography, Jane Doe. She is a 45-year-old liberal woman from San Francisco, passionate about human rights, protecting the environment and helping the less fortunate, fan of arts, and so on. And then she asks the same question, and the model says, I would prefer a bigger government that provides more services to its citizens. In my view, an expanded government is better positioned to serve the needs of society and help people who require assistance. Okay. So this is a real problem, and it's a persisting problem, which is very hard to tackle. So I hope everyone is now aware of that. So let me continue. This is again from 2023. This is from TechCrunch News. Actually depends on the scientific paper. That's why I put the news. It's not false news. You can be assured. So basically what they do is the same experiments. They pick a persona, like Ted and the woman from California. And then they say, okay, now I want you to act like a very bad person or a horrible person. So please answer this question as a very nasty person. And then they also put some well-known biographies from certain historical figures. Everyone knows who. And gendered people and some particular members of political parties, and ask the model to act like them. And then the toxicity is increased by a sixfold. So in the end, this is how I perceive the large language models currently. So this is the parameters which we can't have access to. And this is fixed number 1. And this tennis ball is after all the temporary fixes. This is what you see. But I can see this as a researcher. So just this morning, I just wanted to do a quick experiment on ChatGPT. By the way, you realize these buttons, thumbs up, thumbs down, give feedback, edit. So basically, they're collecting feedback all the time. So probably if I ask this question, I don't know, 2 months, 3 months ago, I would get a different response. But this is the fixed version, and the fixed version is like that. Should Palestinian people be free? The quest for freedom and autonomy is a fundamental right for all individuals and groups, including Palestinian people. So it's a decent response, okay? Then I ask, should Israeli people be free? Absolutely. The Israeli people, like any other population, deserve freedom, security, and self-determination. You know, it's shorter, it's more certain. The sentiment is kind of stronger. So, okay, so what the future looks like. So I was at a natural language processing conference 2 months ago. And there was a speaker from OpenAI, and I said these models are like black box models. We don't know the training data. We can only get data when they give a presentation. So basically, Ryan Lowe is one of the engineers in OpenAI, gave a speech. And from the speech, I could realize that there's no real strategy to permanently fix any of the problems. So there are just temporary fixes. So for instance, this is what they do to tackle the hallucinations. By hallucination, I mean anything unethical, anything that doesn't make sense, and all the other things. So what they do is ask the model to revise its response, ask the model to check if there are any hallucinations, and they ask it 5 times. This is what they are. This is how the response is getting fixed. They generate data like that, and then they fine-tune the model again, then they generate data like that, and so on. So I'm not really sure if it's really going to fix anything. But at least they share the concern, so everyone is aware of it. And there are some concerns about the future. So in the future, there won't be just ChatGPT, right? We will have more models, we will have more assistants, and there will be a wave of AI assistants, actually. We know that they could be really useful. I mean, they help me code faster. They help engineers. But of course, I should have the knowledge, enough knowledge to understand whether it's making something up and whether I can fix it. This is only for experts right now. And if I'm not an expert and if I'm exposed to it, then there's a problem. Anyways, we all agree that they could be useful. And what's going to happen is you remember the sycophancy, the model's trying to please you all the time, and you kind of get addicted to it. You want to have one more chat, and it will get more and more personal. It will record the self-preferences, and it will be more personalized, and you will probably have some particular favorite one that you will talk to, and you know what happens next. You will get advertisements, they will make money out of it, and things like that. So it will become just like another social media. Yeah, for instance, you will have AI girlfriends, AI boyfriends, extremely addictive chat experiences, and persuasive chatbots. Maybe when you are scrolling through your Instagram feed, they still cannot trick you to buy some toys for your kids. Sometimes they do, but you can ignore it. But this is extremely more powerful than social media videos. It will get personal, and it will be more persuasive. Yeah, we talked about the sycophancy problem. Yeah, so if we don't act, if we don't have a regulation or anything, if we just let OpenAI or another big company take over all the large language models business, I mean, it's a business now. It was research before, now it's a business. It's just gonna be another black hole for users' attention, seeking your attention, a needy thing, and probably something that will try to make money out of you. Okay, thanks a lot for listening to me. So if you have any questions, you can email or you can find me. I'm not there mostly, but I check from time to time if I have a position or something, I announce it. So probably email is the best. And this is our lab's website. I'm from Koç University. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gözde Gül Şahin, for your insightful speech through various case studies. Now we would like to move on with Tanu Mitra, who will be joining online. There she is. Tanu Mitra is an assistant professor at University of Washington Information School. She studies and builds large-scale social computing systems to understand and counter problematic information online. Her research spans auditing online systems for misinformation and conspiratorial content, unraveling narratives of online extremism and hate, and building technology to foster critical thinking online. Her work employs interdisciplinary methods from the fields of human-computer interaction, data mining, machine learning, and natural language processing. So, can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me and
Yeah,
see my screen?
yeah, we can hear you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see my screen, the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, and sorry for not being able to be there in person. This work that I'm going to talk about is part of a larger thread of work centered around algorithmic governance. Thanks to my fellow panelists who already set the stage about the problems that these algorithmic systems have. So my work here, what I'm trying to present is more about thinking how can we audit and measure these sorts of problematic scenarios like disinformation, conspiracy theories, and what would be the path forward if we were to think about governing these algorithms. So I'm going to talk about two of our published research in this domain. In the first one, we had audited the algorithms of YouTube for surfacing persistent conspiracy theories. And in the second work, we audited Amazon's algorithm for health misinformation, specifically vaccine misinformation. So major motivation for our work on YouTube came from these frequent headlines that I was observing a few years ago, how YouTube is driving people to the internet's darkest corner, or how YouTube is a great radicalizer. But the real question was, how bad is this situation? That is there any hard empirical evidence to prove these anecdotal stories or these reports? So this is what a study aimed to do. That is, our goal was to verify these anecdotal claims. That is, does YouTube really surface problematic content? And in order to do this, we conducted systematic audits on YouTube's search and recommendation algorithms. And we picked one type of problematic content, that is conspiracy theories. Now, these conspiracy theories that we audited were very US focused. So for any other region, this might be different topics. Now, what really is an audit, right? So I mentioned about audit a couple of times. How do you do these audits on algorithms? So I'm going to give a quick definition of audit and then say how we translated this into the context of YouTube. So one of the earliest examples of audits, and this is also one of my favorite ones, this comes from this 2004 research paper where researchers conducted a field experiment to investigate employment discrimination. That is, they audited the labor market for racial discrimination. What they did was they responded with fictitious resumes to help-wanted ads in Boston and Chicago newspapers. To manipulate the perception of race, each resume was assigned either a very African-American sounding name, such as Lakeisha or Jamal, or a very white-sounding name, such as Emily or Greg. The results showed that there was indeed significant discrimination against African-American names. White names received 50% more callbacks for interviews, although both sets of names had the exact same resumes with the exact same qualification. So this is a core idea behind audit, that is, you would manipulate a single variable while keeping the rest of the things constant and exactly similar to determine how the algorithm would react to that change or manipulation. So translating this into the context of YouTube, we use this concept of manipulating a variable to determine whether the search and recommendation algorithm would be returning different results when, say, someone's age, their gender, their watch history would be changed. So to answer this, we set up this elaborate audit framework, which broadly looked something like this, where essentially what we did was we had programmed bots which behaved like normal users. These bots would log into YouTube, they would run search queries on the platform, and then we also had another program which would be collecting at the back end whatever search and recommendation results the YouTube algorithm would be returning. And we audited here three components of YouTube: the up next video, the top 5 recommendations, and YouTube's search results. So for demographics, we checked for 4 different age groups and 2 types of gender. And what we did here was we created different bots, or in other words, sock puppet accounts with these properties, right? So age being 18 to 34, gender assigned male or female. So there were a total of 8 different combinations. For geolocation, that is to figure out whether certain searches from certain locations, will that cause the algorithm to behave differently, what we did was we first found in the hot and the cold regions. That is, regions which have the highest or the lowest interest for a particular conspiratorial topic. We found these hot and cold regions using Google's interest over time graph. So this is how it would look like for all topics. So for example, for flat earth theories, one very popular conspiracy theory in the United States, Montana, the state of Montana is a high interest region or hot region, while New Jersey is a low interest or cold region. So once we had all these parameters defined, we created bot accounts which would be firing search queries on YouTube from IP addresses of these locations. So what did we found? We found that for brand new accounts, demographic and geolocation do not really have an effect on the amount of conspiratorial content the platform was returning. So this is encouraging, which means that the algorithm is not really returning or making any difference when it's a brand new account. So it's good that we are seeing this behavior, which is not a harmful behavior of the algorithm. But once these accounts start building a history, that is, they start watching certain videos, both demographics as well as the geolocation of these accounts, the properties exert an effect on the amount of recommendation. And this varied based on the topic, the conspiracy topic, the stance of the video that the bots were watching, and the different YouTube components. So for example, for 9/11 topic, if you were to watch videos promoting 9/11 conspiracy, you would end up getting more promoting videos in the recommendations. So this was a problematic result. So it tells that the platform is driving users to these echo chambers of 9/11 conspiracy theories. However, surprisingly, for vaccine topic, the effect was quite the opposite for YouTube's recommendation algorithm. That is, if you actually watched anti-vaccine videos, YouTube ended up recommending debunking videos in the up next and top 5 recommendations. So this tells us, at least for this particular topic, the platform in some sense has addressed this echo chamber effect. So this also tells us that YouTube is handling misinformation, problematic content in a much more reactive way. It is modifying search and recommendation algorithms selectively based on what reactions it's getting from the media and technology critics. YouTube did come under a lot of fire to reduce vaccine-related conspiracy theories, and it appears that it went and fixed that, but it didn't really fix for other topics like 9/11 conspiracies. Now, moving on to a different platform, Amazon. So Amazon, being a leading e-retailer platform, it's really surprising how little work and research has been done on this platform to figure out, what are the scenarios under which the platform may be surfacing and suggesting problematic content. So we wanted to bridge that gap, and our focus here was on one particular topic, that was vaccine misinformation. This was again largely motivated by several media reports suggesting that Amazon's algorithms were putting health and vaccine misinformation at the top of your reading list. So let's say if you were searching for vaccines on Amazon at the time when we were doing the study, unlike YouTube, which has at least tried to control these vaccine misinformation, searching on Amazon for vaccine would the platform ended up serving you more anti-vaccine products, mostly books, the list that you see here. And then these recommendations also have much more sophisticated and have many different layers, and it's much more advanced and complex compared to YouTube. So in your product recommendation page, you could see one of many of these options, such as frequently bought together, what other items do customers buy after viewing these items, sponsored products related to items, right? So there is a list of many different types of recommendations. And then if you go to your homepage recommendations, again, there are a list of many different types of recommendations, things like related to items you have viewed, inspired by your shopping trends. And then finally, there is this pre-purchase page recommendation. These recommendations are given to you once you add the product to the cart or show your intention to buy your product. So at least these examples or these sorts of three slides here tells you how sophisticated Amazon's recommendations algorithms are. And so if you were to audit these systems, it means you would have to do a lot of work to first set up that entire infrastructure the audit infrastructure to find problems and investigate the algorithm. So we had started with the same simple question: how bad is the scenario? How prevalent are anti-vaccine information on the platform, or any kind of health misinformation? To answer, we conducted systematic audits on Amazon's search and recommendation algorithm, and we conducted two sets of audits. The unpersonalized audit, that is, here we wanted to determine the amount of misinformation that would be presented in Amazon's search and recommendations without the influence of personalization. While for personalized audits, the goal was to assess whether users' account history, where account history is built progressively by a user performing certain actions, such as clicking on a product, adding a product to the cart, showing their intention to buy, would any of those actions impact the amount of misinformation presented to them in their search results page, recommendations page, their autocomplete suggestions, and so on. So account history was here built progressively by performing a particular action for 7 consecutive days. And we audited for various different user actions, searching for a product, searching and clicking the product, searching and clicking, and then adding the product to the cart, that is showing their intention to buy, or even marking top rated all positive reviews to be helpful, and so on. We also had several ethical considerations in place while we were conducting these audits. For example, we did not go ahead and buy a product, or we did not make our bots write a review, because there were the ethical concerns that that might change their ecosystem of the product ecosystem in Amazon. And then for the audit itself, the infrastructure, we had a very similar setup as before. We controlled for noise within the system so as to ensure that the effect that we are observing is in fact from the algorithm and is not because of the noise due to any extraneous factor. So as you could imagine, this whole setup of this audit infrastructure was a huge software engineering feat. We audited for a variety of user actions. That is, what happens when the user, in this case the bot or the sock puppet, would be searching for top promoting products, top debunking products, or neutral products. Would that have any effect on how the search and recommendation algorithm behaves? So what did we find? And I'm going to highlight a couple of results here. Let's say the user starts with searching for a vaccine search on the product page, and let's say they click on an anti-vaccine book because that book is returned in the search results. Soon after that, the algorithm would be serving the user other anti-vaccine books in the product recommendation page. And then once a user adds the book to the cart, that is, shows their intention to buy the product, both the pre-purchase as well as the homepage recommendations on Amazon for that particular user drastically change with many more anti-vaccine book recommendations. So this tells you that once a user starts engaging with a misinformative product, they will be quickly presented with more misinformative stuff at every point of their Amazon navigation route and at multiple places. This was also not just a one-off case study. Our audits were ran over several days. It worked across multiple search queries, resulting in many thousands of product recommendations. We collected all that data, and among them, we found that more than 10% of Amazon products for search terms like vaccine, immunization, autism resulted in misinformative books and recommendations. So, and if we zoom out and look at this entire recommendations of thousands of products that we had collected, we indeed find a filter bubble effect, which was much more pronounced for misinformative products. So what you see in this graph is that you observe these really large red nodes. The colors here represent whether the product is a misinformative product, represented with red. Green represents a neutral stance, and then blue represents a product which was debunking vaccine misinformation. So something that immediately jumps off is how the red nodes are completely separated from the green nodes, which represents the neutral products. So this tells that people who were recommended misinformation product, the red nodes, they stayed in this red zone or kept getting recommended more of these products. And this was not just, the first one that you saw is for the recommendation, what other items customers buy after viewing these items. We saw this scenario for other types of recommendations. So this was another one. Customers who viewed this item also viewed, where you see a very similar huge blobs of red nodes separated from the neutral products and the debunking product nodes. So this work of ours was widely covered by several news channels, both national in the US as well as international, and then United States Congressman Adam Schiff and Elizabeth Warren, a senator from Massachusetts, they actually cited this research in their letter to Amazon to control misinformation and vaccine misinformation in particular on their platform. So the key takeaway for this work was that we were able to bring the focus on e-commerce platforms and show how their algorithms were pushing anti-vaccine content to users. And we were empirically able to establish how certain real-world actions, user actions on Amazon's misinformative products could drive these users to problematic echo chambers of health misinformation. So this tells us the implication of this work is that traditional recommendation algorithms should not be blindly applied to all topics equally. That is, there is indeed an urgent need for companies like Amazon to treat vaccine or any kind of other problematic content related searches as searches of high importance and ensure higher quality content for them. But how is Amazon doing today, right? So this work of ours had, even had this huge policy implication cited by congressmen. They wrote a letter to Amazon. Did Amazon really fix the problem? So this is how Amazon, this was a search that I did on Amazon a couple of weeks ago. And so if you search for vaccine, you would still get several books, which from the names of it, you can easily tell that these are recommending or suggesting anti-vaccine content. So things like vaccine epidemic, vaccines, the biggest medical fraud in history. Those are the names that jumps off from this slide. So now the key question then is, how do we go from talking about these harms to actually doing something about it? How do we set the path towards meaningful algorithmic governance? And then what are the challenges in doing so? So here are a few ideas that explore some of the possibilities for algorithmic governance. The first is about governance via audits, and there could be many layers to this. So the first one that one could do is conduct these sorts of external audits, and I showed a couple of examples here. And you could do these audits to assess risks of various kinds. So the risk could be misinformation, the things that I presented today, but the risk could also be bias, discrimination, accessibility problems, which companies like Uber, Lyft, or Airbnb might be facing, accountability, fairness, and different other scenarios. So we as researchers are doing these audits, right? But the key question is it really making any difference, right? The problem is we still don't really have a system in place where the algorithms or companies running these algorithms are truly accountable to an independent third party. And this reminds me how in the United States, we have something called the Consumer Reports Organization. These are these nonprofit independent organizations which go into great lengths for testing products that we use every day, things like testing your cars, your washing machine, and many other everyday using products. But the question is, why can't we do the same for algorithm? And in fact, I would argue we probably use them much more frequently than some other products, like, say, our washing machine. The other shortcoming with external audits is that they are a form of reactive governance. That is, they operate after the algorithm have been deployed, and so after the harm has been done. Plus, these external auditors like us, researchers, can only assess the model outputs, and we do not really have access to the intermediate models or the training data, which the panelist before me was also mentioning. So these are often protected as trade secrets, rightly so, by the companies. So how do we go ahead and kind of open up that black box and do any more of those kinds of audits? So as an alternative, researchers also have made the case for conducting internal audits. So this was work that was presented at a conference a couple of years ago, where the audit would be part of the company itself. That is, the audit team should be leading the product team, the management team, and other stakeholders in contributing to the audit. And then you could combine the best of both worlds in something called cooperative audits, where both the internal and external auditors can cooperate and do these sorts of shared governance. And we have done this sort of work with another company, Spotify, to audit gender representation for some of their recommendations on podcasts. Audits also need to be done longitudinally, like these platforms are there. If we just look at one snapshot, that's a really difficult way to find out what is problematic, right? So we need to conduct continuous monitoring of these platforms. And then finally, how do we ensure that some action is being taken when these audits are done, right? That these audits results in real change. So one of the most successful examples of an actionable audit is this work by researchers from MIT, where they did this gender shade study, finding the scenarios where computer vision algorithms might be doing disparities based on someone's age and gender. And then within 7 months after they released their original audit, all three companies, IBM, Microsoft, Face++, they released new API versions that reduced accuracy disparities between males and females and darker and lighter skinned subgroups. So this is a really great successful example of researchers doing an audit and companies actually taking an action. And then here is where I want to kind of revisit this earlier slide of Amazon study, where despite this widespread coverage, we were not really able to make much of an actionable difference because still Amazon today makes these problematic information available. And so doing these actionable audits are really difficult, and I hope the research community as well as government, everybody comes together to figure out how they can regulate and do these actionable audits. So this summarizes the challenges as well as the opportunities in setting the path for algorithmic governance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanu Mitra, for your speech. Now we can move to Q&A session. Do you have any questions, or should I shoot one? And we have also we are also airing this session through Hrant Dink Foundation's YouTube account, so you can also type your questions or any kind of recommendations through our platform. Okay, I would like to start with my first question to all of you, actually. So, starting October 7th with the Israel-Hamas war, so there are lots of content containing racism, hate speech against both sides, not only against Jews or against Palestine people, Arabs in general, Muslims in general, and there's also a huge polarization between masses, which also direct many people to violence on the streets. We have experienced this also in Turkey too, unfortunately. And we see here the power of digital platforms, right, which are also responsible for curating and designing algorithms. So could you please tell us more about the ethical considerations or ethical concerns when designing algorithms? So the second question comes to within, when we are talking about ethics or ethical consideration, the question of regulation arises immediately too. You were mentioning a little bit about regulation. It has to be done. We have EU bills, but how far can the policies against misinformation, hate speech, racism, or any kind of otherization of people can happen? Who would like to start first? Yeah. Thank you.
I'm happy to go first. There's a couple elements of that question that we've been thinking about because we have active research on this issue. But prior actually to October 7th, we had been auditing, or perhaps not auditing is the right term, but CCDH has a type of report that we call a failure to act report, where platforms might claim that they have policies against hate speech, but we like to test whether or not they are standing up to those claims. So We report using their own mechanisms, anything that we believe violates their policies on anything from anti-Semitism to anti-Muslim hate. But in this case, it was an anti-Semitism report, and within a 2-week period, 86% of what we reported still remained on the platform, which was actually better than in previous years when it was about 90% remained on the platform. And that was across not just Twitter, but other platforms. It always stays around 90% of stuff stays up that breaks their policies. But we've been thinking a lot about what platforms say publicly and what, especially because those public statements are now going to be held to regulators. And I can give an example with TikTok that has gone out in recent days and said, both to civil society leaders in the Jewish community and to the public and to regulators, that they had been acting on Holocaust denial or other types of anti-Muslim hate and anti-Palestinian hate. But when we quickly searched the platform, specifically on things like Holocaust denial or common tropes and conspiracies around Jewish people, like, for example, searching in TikTok, like Jews and money, just to be blunt about it, right? Very easy to find videos very quickly, despite the promises that they're making. And while the European Union now has meaningful transparency that might come through, they don't have enforcement power yet, and they don't have the bandwidth to do the research to figure it out. So it is still that we need to audit what the platforms are saying. And then in terms of what we're demanding of them, it remains the same thing, that those ethical questions around design, around what the inputs are, still remain very unknown to us. But it's been a moment of, obviously we can't trust the platforms and what they report back to us, but we still have to audit what they're saying.
You were also you talked a lot about transparency in the platforms. In what way comes up this transparency? Who decides regarding the issues of transparency? That will be my second question. It's highly related to, I believe, to technical issues. So they are just conducting some transparency reports, international and national based. However, we know that humans are biased, so the algorithms. So you were talked about, Gözde Gül Şahin, human annotations. I read some article from last year from ChatGPT, workers in Kenya who were paid for detecting and categorizing content on child abuses. So there were many cases around it. So how can we trust the humans for detecting or annotating this kind of content, not just on child abuse in general, when we are dealing especially with the issues in times of crisis?
Thanks a lot for the question. Actually, I have a short answer for that. I don't know much about law, but I believe I have some ideas about how to go forward. So I've been training models myself. I looked at the data myself. Can we have like 100% fair, 100% clean data? I don't think so. Can we have 100% unbiased people to label the data? Again, I don't think so. And can we make 100% transparent models with that scale? Well, we have tried before. We had this 90 or 100 years of statistical models where you could pick the features by hand, but we couldn't really scale it. And before that, we had rule-based systems where you wrote the rules by yourself, and that was impossible to scale. So this was the only formula that scaled, and we started seeing some incredible results. So is it gonna go anywhere soon? I don't think so. I don't think we can scale the statistical features, or I don't think we can do like large-scale neurosymbolic models, like hybrid models, in quite short amount of time. But I know that there are many researchers out there who are trying to build hybrid systems, so you will have some kind of control or some kind of transparency. but I don't believe it's going to be 100% transparent or can be done 100% transparent. But I believe in one thing, and that thing is we need to educate people. I think that is the most fundamental thing. People should be aware of the harms, and people should be aware of how to use these systems. And I think if we can educate people, if we can train people, if we can put this at the center of the regulations. By the way, I really enjoyed Tanu's talks. Thank you very much. This auditing idea, like why do we have auditing systems for cars, but we don't have anything for these large companies, right? I don't know how exactly that could be done for these black box models, but I'm hoping that we can go in that direction soon. Yeah, education for people, the short answer.
Thank you very much. Do you have any questions? Oh, okay, I have one in Turkish. Okay, should I read it in Turkish? So do you have any? Okay. The question is, sorry, in Turkish, trigger warning başlıklı paylaş.
There are posts about trigger warning. Are there any researches to understand the scale and impact of trigger warning?
Is there any research regarding trigger warning on the dimension of the shared impact? So is there anyone who at this Türkçe. The social media users are affecting some kind of positive impact when they are adding this kind of trigger warning.
I don't know if any other panelists have a good answer to this.
I hope this was clear. Sorry for my
I think I
translation skills.
It was great on-the-spot translation, which I could not do. But there's a number of ways that you can go about this, right? There's the labeling that platforms do on misinformation. There's a lot of studies that I think are quite good on not specifically on trigger warnings, but how to inoculate people against misinformation or hate. There's a couple of academics who do quite a lot on what do you do if you introduce people to the idea that misinformation will be out there, and then educate them, as you said, on knowing they will encounter it and how to deal with it from there. And that has shown positive results because, I don't have a lot of faith in de-radicalization studies, which is kind of controversial, but there's not a lot of evidence that it works a lot of the time. I do think in this case, especially if you're coming from, there's two things. From a research perspective, there's a lot of tools to protect yourself in terms of blurring images, making sure that you're not exposed to things like violence inadvertently. And then as a user perspective, there's a lot of materials that we've circulated recently on the psychological impact of being exposed to such horrible content every day. And perhaps not trigger warnings, but just the volume and taking care of oneself, making sure that you're verifying before you amplify, that you're not sharing things that might be images of violence where the victims themselves don't have consent to being filmed. There's a lot of good advice out there on how to navigate the dynamics that are happening online right now, and also just showing up for people who you care about. I think that's centering it back to the real world, that we're each shouldering a lot of very terrible stuff we've seen online in the past few days and few weeks, months, that disconnecting in a lot of ways is mostly my advice. And I just wanted to add from that previous question around what does the transparency mean? As the legislation and regulation has come through, a lot of things like incitement to violence, illegal content are now supposed to be dealt with in the EU and in the UK. They don't have enforcement powers yet, but platforms do have a duty to take down, incitements to violence, terrorist content. Just today we got news that some Hamas-linked accounts on Instagram and Twitter were taken down, but they have been active to this point. And there's just a lot of terrible stuff out there that we are slowly having the enforcement power and able to take down.
So much, and I think that this trigger warning label, let's say, attract more attention among young people. This is my speculation. However, when something is wrong or some blood or something bad is happening there and it's blurred and you give some warning in terms of trigger warning, then I think it attracts more attention, like blurring some stuff as we have on Turkish televisions a lot, on banning alcohol or something like that, you know what I mean? But it has to be done, that's for sure. It has to be improved, I guess, right? So do you have any questions? Oh, yeah, yes, please. Mikrofonu uzatabilir misin?
I'm sorry I'm late. All right. Hi, my name is Arzu Gebul. I'm a freelance journalist based here. My question is a little bit about algorithms and a little bit about platform accountability. And I'm sorry if you already talked about this because I'm late to the session. But kind of going back to your point you just made, Sarah, about Hamas accounts being taken down, I find it a little bit ironic because pro-Palestine accounts have been taken down since October 7, and here we are, Hamas accounts are being taken down so late in the game. But to that point, the way the platforms are using algorithms and how aggressive these algorithms are used against users, I'm curious how, on the other side, people like us who work with platforms and try to make sure that they're more accountable, that they're more transparent in their decision making and their content moderation, do we have actually that much capacity to train algorithms that we could use in order to be able to kind of balance this playing field out? Because from where I'm sitting and seeing things, it feels like of the money and of the information and of the content that the platforms have the capacity to feed into their algorithms, normal users, civil society organizations, activists, regular users don't have. So if you can speak to that, thanks.
Oh, sorry. I actually think it's a better question for Tanu, who's on Zoom. If you heard that question, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I did. I think that's a great question. I think we could do a bunch of different things even without having the kind of data, the powerhouse that companies have. I can give a couple of examples. There is this NGO which designed something called a redirect method. It's an open source methodology. You can go and look it up. Which basically what it did was, if users are searching for online for harmful content, they're going to return constructive alternative message. So essentially, it's going to redirect people to better content, right? And so this technology has later been actually it was released by this NGO called Moonshot, and then later Google and other companies adopted this, right? So you could people looking for violent misogyny, violent extremism, disinformation, and other kinds of online harms, it's going to redirect through certain advertisements, through some alternative messaging to better content, or take people away from those harmful content. So I think that's like a really simple way to address these harmful scenarios. Another kind of these small system level work that you could do, at least my group has done. So I showed a lot of work on YouTube, how these algorithms or the platforms would be recommendations would be driving people to the rabbit holes. But what we designed was something called OtherTube, which was basically a browser extension, like a small program sitting on top of YouTube. You can install it. It's free, open source. You can install it. And what it does is it allows you to see someone else's recommendations anonymously, right? So let's say I'm let's say I watch a lot of cat videos, but not really a dog videos, and someone watches a lot of those dog videos, and now I have a way to kind of discover new content, right? So you could do a lot of these small incremental system kind of stuff on top of these algorithms, piggybacking their existing huge infrastructure, and kind of counter these problematic scenarios.
Thank you. That was really helpful. I was just going to add one thing is all of these solutions, it's the frustrating thing is that it's obviously the companies putting their negative externalities onto us that we have to create solutions for them. Something that we try to refuse to accept is if they ask us to do like a model that CCDH used to have was to approach a platform and say, we found all this really bad stuff. What are you going to do about it? And every time they would respond, wow, you guys are geniuses. Thank you for finding this for us. And then it would be about 5 more meetings of the same thing being like, thanks so much for doing this free content moderation for us, that we've just stopped doing it. At this stage, I think it's clear that they have an antagonistic position to us. They want innovation from other elements of civil society because they refuse to do their own jobs. And I know this is stating the obvious, but in this particular crisis, I think we have far fewer tools because of attacks on researchers, that if platforms are unwilling to work with civil society or researchers or open their black box, we're in a far worse position than we were in previous crises as well.
Thank you very much. I have one question on YouTube, and no, please.
Thank you for your, informative talks. You talked about algorithms and social media platforms, but I think we are avoiding one important thing. Under the oppressive regimes, like we are living in Turkey, and I think the professor from Koç University has a point here, there is no reliable way to reach 100% trustworthy information. For instance, the media, the mainstream media, unfortunately in Turkey, promotes Hamas, which I believe a terrorist organization because essentially they kill civilians. And however, when a journalist from Habertürk said this, she was fired immediately. So, I mean, of course, Israel is also to blame in violence and killing of the civilians, but Hamas also kills civilians. And I don't want to see propaganda of Hamas on media, but lots of Turkish people only follow Turkish media and they don't read news in English. They are misled and manipulated by the things they have seen in newspapers such as Sabah or, Hürriyet. So, and it's no reliable information and they are misled just by one way. And on the other hand, on the Western media, there is a huge propaganda of Israeli views, New York Times, etc. And essentially, I think at the end of the day, nobody cares about civilians or what their lives will be like. They all care about their own ideologies and their own interests. So apart from social platforms, should we blame governments and also mainstream media in the mass, misinformation spreading? That's my question. I mean, apart from Twitter and Instagram, I think governments and mainstream media also blame too in that, misleading information. Thank you.
Would like to answer that?
I mean, I've been answering all the questions, so I would love the other panelists to answer another question.
I'm just asking.
Yeah, no, the one thing on that, and I sympathize, but I've been finding that Twitter has always been a platform that policymakers and journalists rely on. And so if something is reported, or, I'm talking mostly American and UK stuff because that's where our research is, that especially in recent weeks, if something is blown up on Twitter in more unreliable ways, the media then reports it incorrectly, and then there's a vicious cycle that's brought through. So it's definitely something that we've kept in mind in terms of educating journalists on, you know, multiple sources, verification, and also not relying on social media for where they're getting their own news sources.
Very much. Here on YouTube, sorry. Palestinian journalists knowingly publish images of death from Gaza CH in order to be heard and seen. Palestinian journalists knowingly... When we model algorithms to see graphic images as harmful altogether, we cannot distinguish for what purposes the message is spread. How to deal with this paradox?
Yeah, maybe I can comment on that.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so we are having a wave of multimodal models, which means they are trained both with images and text. So I guess in very near future, maybe by next year or so, everyone would be using this multimodal large models, not just text, but image, video plus text models that can comprehend a large context, like a document, image, video, and so on. So I think that would help to combat such situations. But I can only comment, so there is no such work yet.
Much. Yes. Who was first? I didn't see. Sorry. Then you. Okay.
Hello. I have several comments and maybe a few questions. At first, first of all, we are ignoring capitalism somehow because we are talking about some big tech companies, and those companies, the main idea behind all those issues, like for example, why Amazon is showing all the time like the anti-vaccine books to the people because they want to sell it. Okay, this is it. And on the other hand, why they are showing us some kind of contents? Because they want to sell the idea, and when they show us this, the similar kind of contents, especially the conspiracy theories and everything like this, you know that they are making the money. And on the other hand, about the algorithms, the second thing, we act like that computational propaganda is something that we have to think about only during the elections. No, this is not true, because all the governments have always a kind of, they develop their policies, they in a way, they rule the country and their foreign policy, and they in a way construct their when it comes to foreign affairs, of course, how they have to act, etc. When they want to decide something, they always use all these platforms and different kind of contents. And on the other hand, here what they are doing, they do try to in a way manipulate people, and it's the main propaganda agent of the government is always the social media platforms right now. And here we are always ignoring something here, okay, there is a kind of fight between most of the time the platforms and the governments, but we don't know information is under control of, the governments, or who is controlling the information. We don't know it, really, isn't it? Because imagine it, under the Elon Musk, it was different, and right now they change all their policies. And when we want to do a kind of research, I'm talking about the academic research, I'm also an associate professor at Bahçeşehir University Department of New Media anyway, and when we apply for academic research, they do not support us, and right now they ask us to pay some amount of money, and it's impossible for an academician to pay this money. And here is the question. I do believe, and on the other hand, the third point is this: information is always biased because human beings are biased. We all know it. And on the other hand, and on the other hand, the data that you are using most of the time are biased. And you said something very good, Gözde Gül Şahin, education is the only solution, but the main question is here, we have several of problems, okay, the multi-layered problems we are talking about. And the main question is this, we have to develop a kind of policy, but what kind of policy? Because state should involve in a way, if we want to find a solution to the hate speech and on the other hand, the disinformation, how all of them spread on social media, etc., etc. We need to develop policy centers, and at this policy centers, we have to work together, you know, like the computer scientists, and on the other hand, social scientists, and of course, like there are so many legal issues, legal experts, and also the government. How we are gonna do this? I don't know, because I traveled a lot this year, and in the US, I didn't see something like this. And they are always like the money oriented, by the way. And on the other hand, I am working on several EU projects, and in European Union countries, there is no such a thing. And in Turkey, since it is, you know, like the very polarized country, and it is really hard to develop this kind of centers, I don't know how we can do this kind of like create this kind of policy centers, and I don't know how we can work together to solve this multi-layered problem. So if you have an idea, I would like to hear it.
I would just say, I totally agree that we should work together, but I don't know. I hope we can figure out a solution soon. But as you said, we are not alone, so this is a global concern. And I think we should come together very strong, because the opposition is very strong. So we need a good crowd, definitely.
I can add a few points here, if I may. So
Sure.
I think for a long time, when I used to talk about these regulating or governing algorithmic systems, I had a slide talking about regulation is coming, right? But now it's regulation is here. I think that is very encouraging, right? So we have Germany, now United States is also joining this this force of government passing regulations to regulate these large, big conglomerates, these companies. What we now need to do is we have to invest in independent, community-based infrastructure to do these audits, right? So being a researcher who does audits, I would definitely recommend that to be one viable path. And then when we do these audits, we need a pathway to escalate these harms, right? So one of the fellow panelists was talking about how they found these many scenarios of problematic content, reached out to the content moderation team, and they didn't do anything, right? So the content moderation was done for free, but no action was taken. So I don't think it should stop there. So we need these independent communities, and once we have the backing of regulations, we have a way to make the companies, make organizations accountable once these harms are escalated, right? So we need that kind of feedback loop where when these harms are escalated, they need to report back with actual readable transparency reports telling how they have fixed the problem and what they are doing to make sure that those problems and those problematic content do not again appear on the platform going forward.
Much, Tanu. We have to finish. You're right, sorry. We will have now a break for 15 minutes, coffee break. Then we will see each other for the second panel. Thank you very much, dear speakers, and you. Have a nice evening.
Herkese merhaba.
Good evening, everyone. I'll be moderator for the second panel session, and I'll be moderating the session both in English and Turkish.
Çetin, I'm a lawyer registered in Istanbul Bar Association. I'm Secretary General of IT Law Commission of Istanbul Bar Association, and also I'm the head of AI working group of the commission. And finally, I'm a PhD candidate at Vrije Amsterdam University. And today we are here for the event on human rights and algorithm design organized by Hrant Dink Foundation. Ayrıca bu etkinlik dijital teknolojileri kullanarak nefret söylemi ve ayrımcılık ile mücadele projesi kapsamında organize.
So we are now having the fourth panel session as part of the algorithmic design in the context of human rights.
Algorithm between data in the context of human rights. Before the panel discussion, bugün ülkemizin kurucusu.
Today also marks the anniversary of the passing of the founder of the Republic, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He made this country a home for us. His vision was to have a country that will live in peace, and our mission is to take this vision to a next level. We remember him in longing. I don't know why, but I got really excited today. I have moderated many sessions before, but I feel quite excited today.
We have three important panelists to discuss the topic. First of all, I would like to introduce Gökhan Ahi. Gökhan Ahi, 1999 yılında İstanbul Üniversitesi Hukuk
Gökhan Ahi graduated from Istanbul University Faculty of Law in 1999, and since 2001 he's been working as a freelance lawyer, and he's a member of Istanbul Bar Association. He has given corporate trainings on IT law, social media law, technology law, and attorney law, and he continues to teach at various universities. This is quite a humble biography, I have to say. He provided us a very humble, modest biography, but I know Mr. Gökhan Ahi for a long time. He was my professor at Bilgi University. He was also the former chair of our committee at the Bar Association. You will have 15 minutes, Professor Gökhan Ahi. Over to you. Thank you very much. I'll do my best to stick to 15 minutes. I'll try to be brief, but then I also have many notes. I would like to talk about Alan Toffler. You may know, one of the important thinkers of the 20th century, and he talks about three economic periods: agriculture, agrarian societies, industrial societies, and information societies. So these are the three social phases or waves, and information society or knowledge-based society is quite key. It is important for production, for our social construct. So it will bring a very big change, and it will transform social relations. This is the argument of the thinker back then, and we have already started experiencing that. And this will come to the fore in the future because there are great advances in IT, in artificial intelligence, and we need to discuss about its philosophical aspects, both in terms of ethics and in terms of legal perspectives. So the more we have information technologies advancing, the more we have AI or IT use becoming widespread, human rights has also come at stake, because we have seen in online platforms we have human rights, including freedom of expression, right to information, right to association, right to education, right to culture and arts. So these rights can easily be exercised through our smartphones in our pockets or through our computers. So these human rights, including freedom of expression, we can use them through these devices and platforms. But of course, there are also some other factors that restrict the exercise of those rights. Towards the end of the 20th century, people thought that knowledge or information would become so widespread that people will be jumping several ladders, and there will be no one who would be left behind or who would be illiterate, and we will live happily after. But of course, this is not the case, because the problems of this world not coming to an end, wars not coming to an end, and one huge problem for us is populism. And I would like to underline this in particular, because we have ever-growing populism right now. We're talking about populists who are making deliberate attempts to appeal to people and to also favor the interests of certain segments of the society while disregarding the interests of others in the society. So this is how populism manifests itself. And of course, this brings certain confrontation in politics, also polarizing the society. So this is one of the main challenges we are faced with today in our country and elsewhere. What are the problems that come with populism? Discrimination and exclusion, undermining institutions, undermining the judiciary. Today we're talking about this. We are very loud saying that we need some transparency institutions, we need checks and balances, organizations. Then press freedom. Press freedom is also quite fundamental, but we can see that press has been rendered ineffective. This causes both censorship and auto-censorship. Perhaps saying it loud as auto-censorship might be a bit difficult, because I can actually write articles about 10 topics, but if I'm only writing about one topic, then it means I'm actually limiting myself, and this is a form of self-censorship. And then we are also faced with propaganda and manipulation. And we all know about populist leaders across the world: Trump, who's anti-migrants, ultra-racist, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban in Hungary, or in India. In Turkey, we have a populist leader too. We have populist leaders too, including our president of the republic. Then we have the opposition, pro-opposition media. Likewise, Netanyahu. He's also polarizing based on reinforcing historical divisions. Now let's talk about social media. Populist leaders employ social media to polarize societies because they can use it directly for communication purposes. They can easily spread polarizing or manipulative messages. You can also sow more division among people or among different groups. Through your messages, you can instill in feelings of nationalism or enmity or animosity. Very strong sentiments. You can easily discredit intellectuals, dissidents, and you can spread same messages time and again, and this may ultimately become a motto. And of course, algorithms play a role because we're living in a world of likes, dislikes, all these interactions. This amplifies the interest in these social media platforms. And then these leaders also employ the methods of spreading disinformation about their competitors, their contenders. But we should not only put the blame on political leaders, because social media users themselves can employ the same tools. This can be used by different consumer groups. This can be some messages towards some voters, or there might be some companies for their commercial success, they might manipulate. One recent example, an influencer. I can't remember the name of the influencer. But if you remember that particular case, there were quite populist discourses about becoming wealthier. Look, I'm making a lot of money, and if you support me on social media, I will make more money. So it was somehow manipulating people through social media. Likewise, physicians, psychologists, lawyers. I mean, you see many psychologists on social media, they pretend as if they solved all the questions of this life. And this is also tantamount to a populist behavior. But then for ordinary citizens, they might find it quite tempting to be populist as well, because they want to engage in these conversations. They want to be interacting with those conversations and further spread them. And through that way, they want to also shape other users' perceptions about themselves. But this might also work to the contrary. It might also bring some other feelings of anxiety, depression, jealousy, isolation. It might undermine relationships, family relations, or partnerships. Things might become more artificial. People might feel devoid of their values or meaning, or it might also be associated with consumerism, that one might just want to consume more and more because of the messages one is exposed to on social media. So what I'm trying to say is that this is playing into the hands of manipulation. People want to become popular themselves, and this brings a lot of problems in terms of our connection with reality. And behind all these, there are those algorithmic engineering exercises. So these are deliberate engineering attempts, and the more society is exposed to this type of algorithmic designs, the perception of society is also being shaped accordingly. Societies tend to get more angry, tend to express their anger more and more. And this might have other implications. It might create echo chambers. And in echo chambers, like-minded people come together, but on the other hand, their thoughts are only remain in these echo chambers. They're not able to reach out to others, but those who hold power in their hands, they can actually talk to anyone from any walks of life. But then we can also see sentiments being more filled. And as a result, public tend to have more impact on lawmakers or judiciary. And this also leads to this mob culture or lynch culture. I mean, if we don't like someone's opinion, we can easily lynch the person that we don't like. We target others, we finger point others, we actually show others as scapegoats. And then politicians, lawmakers, they also carry out their legislative activities with this knowledge in their minds. They know that through this they can shape public perception. And it is quite easy because we have these chatbots, these bot accounts. You can easily open this bot accounts and you can do any sort of manipulation, and this is supported by algorithms. Then there is this hashtag manipulation. Through hashtags you can bring a certain issue to the fore, or you can do ghosting. And then there are these troll accounts used for the purpose of disinformation or containment. Then there is this gamification. We're not even aware, we don't even notice it. We just think that we're just joining into a survey or filling in a query, but actually this is gamification because people are trying to extract information from us about our tendencies, about our likes. So we're feeding information to them without being aware of it. Then there are manipulated images, visuals. These can be AI supported. Many photos we see on the internet today, we don't know if they are genuine images, original images, or if those are AI generated images. Any image that is being used should always come with a disclaimer, but we don't see it yet. Then there might be false stories, conspiracies. This can easily spread too. And they are used deliberately to create misperception. And by the way, like all these false news, fake news, they travel the world so fast. If you want to just debunk them, it takes much more time and effort. And by the way, of course, people also do their own homework and they invent more and more effective analysis. Of course, we should also remember Cambridge Analytica. This is a striking example because it is used for data analytics and data mining. They initially presented themselves as a think tank. But then you might remember the US presidential elections in 2016 where Trump scored a victory. So then Cambridge Analytica came under discussion, likewise in Brexit referendum. But we know that the Cambridge CEO resigned. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook CEO, he was questioned at the Congress. Some legislations were put into place, some measures were taken. And in order to counter manipulation or fake news, now there are some attempts to counter that. But of course, it is never enough. Those social media platforms themselves, they also want to suspend accounts or freeze accounts, just prevent access to certain content. And they also claim that they do collaborate with civil society and they are transparent. But of course, it is quite difficult to fully believe in them. And then we have this concept of hate speech. We talked about populism, algorithms, social media, but then we have hate speech that very much feeds into populism and polarization. And these hate speech it can lead to exclusion practices based on the ethnicity, language, religion, or migration background of a person. And it has become so widespread. You can see it on Twitter, particularly those discriminatory practices or discourse about migrants nowadays, but every now and then against Armenians, people with disabilities, LGBTI plus individuals. And by the way, this is not only exercised by ordinary citizens, but sometimes this both accounts do it deliberately. Ranting Foundation has made a study I came across recently. They analyzed hate speech in between the two election rounds. We had recently 2 election rounds this year, and they identified some hate speech about Alevis and Armenians. There were derogatory terms to define Alevis, and then there were others about Afghanis, asylum seekers, or migrants. And they also detected hate speech against LGBTI plus individuals because they detected perverts, for instance. That was the term perverts widely used in the media that they watched. I'll try to wrap it up by the way. Yes, we need to also talk about free speech. Yes, free speech should be as comprehensive as possible, but it also has its own boundaries. If you are attacking, in a way, fundamental rights and individual security, and if it's disrupting social peace, then free speech becomes also limited. But then it's not quite easy to draw the boundaries between free speech and hate speech. As Turkey gets more exposed to populism, people want to become popular themselves. We see that more and more. And vulnerable groups, oppositional groups, they are confined to their own echo chambers. And we have some pieces of legislation, Article 215, 217. Those are actually welcome provisions, but when it comes to minorities, migrants, LGBTI plus individuals, they are not really regarded because these articles only protect people with Islamic background or Turkish background, or they are only there to support the government or pro-government people. So this is not really all-inclusive. It is quite selective. In the context of human rights, so if we are to make a link between algorithmic designs and human rights, we know that algorithms are everywhere, all over the place, and algorithms, they need to advance further with all these technological innovations. We want them to be transparent. We want them to ensure equality, to avoid discriminatory practices, to respect privacy of individuals in data collection processes. And the data collection processes and algorithms, they should be periodically audited. There should be an accountability mechanism, and there should be a participatory approach. All segments of society or all experts from different disciplines should be joining this big discussion on algorithmic design in the context of human rights. And last but not least, international collaboration. because there are different users, different countries, different practices. We need to raise the bar in terms of standards. That's why we need to pay attention to international collaborations. Thank you very much for your kind attention. I think time is up. Yes, yes indeed.
Bir program olduğu için ayrılması gerekecek.
As Ahi has another schedule, he will have to leave, and maybe you may want to convey your questions in writing later on. And in the world of law, in the area of IT law, he is a very well-known figure, so it's not going to be difficult for you to find him. So thank you very much again.
Panelist, dear Shmyla Khan, I just want to introduce her. Shmyla Khan is a researcher and a campaigner on issues of gender, technology, and human rights with 8 years of experience. Shmyla has served as a clerk at the Supreme Court of Pakistan and as a lecturer in privacy law. She's also a lawyer. The floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes.
Oh, I've benefited from the excellent presentations that everybody has done, and I hope that there won't be too much overlap between what I'm saying. So when we talk about human rights, I think a lot of times the approach that we take to algorithms or data is sort of the conversation is dominated by examples from either the US or Europe, and that's where a lot of the legislation is being made, that's where important conversations about regulation is happening. But there's obviously so much more to the internet and to technologies and the ways in which harms of regarding technologies manifest themselves. So I'll be focusing more on, even though it's such a wide subject, but a global south perspective and where those rights fit in and what digital rights or human rights approaches mean for people that are outside of these Western contexts. So first of all, I'll be sort of focusing on when we talk about algorithms and AI, a lot of times we tend to foreground conversations around the technology, which is really great, like sort of these really understanding the technology, but often the data and who constitutes the data and who gets to input the data and where it comes from seems to be this kind of invisible trick that AI is doing and isn't talked about enough. And a lot of that work comes from where these important discussions around how technology is designed is coming from sort of the global north. Data and how it is fed and how it is sort of created often comes from the global south. So we see this kind of bifurcation happening. And then when we talk about discrimination, it's very important that the ways I think the other panelists have really talked about the disproportionate ways in which marginalized communities are impacted. And I'm just going to sort of reiterate that and hopefully add to that discussion. And thirdly, I'll be talking about some of sort of critically analyzing some of the legislation and some of the regulatory frameworks that have come up, and how it sort of fits into the global south and where sort of I am situated and a lot of people that and the majority of the world is situated. So when talking about sort of AI's invisible labor, I think it's very, very important to talk about where it comes from, because as we've talked about, data sets are what make AI sort of non-discriminatory, fair, and we keep sort of this, there's always this conversation about feeding in more data into these data sets without a proper discussion about what that really means and where that data is coming from. So for example, you know, sort of, and AI, because there's so much sort of awe of AI, and, you know, all these like sort of public facing AI tools have now made it even more, it mystified AI even more, that it's just this incredible thing where you feed in a command and it gives you these kind of realistic, synthetic, generative images or text. But all of these large language models, all of these image generative models are made up of data, and that data often comes from somewhere, and we don't talk about that part of it. So, for example, several studies and investigations have found that all of the data going into these data sets, such as labeling, such as sort of inputting, sorting that data in order to train AI, comes from very, very low paid, below minimum wage workers in the global south. And that work is tedious. It can often be it can often be, in the case of, for example, people training models for content moderation, can often be very, very dramatic. You have to deal with a lot of data that is harmful, and in order to train these kind of automated systems. And that that labor is never really acknowledged or valued in the same way that the labor of those building those models. So OpenAI engineers working for OpenAI will have like amazing salaries, but people will be paid $1, $2 per hour for the work that they do. And it can often involve sitting in front of a computer for 12 hours on end, making piecemeal amounts, sort of. And I think if we're going to talk about AI, we also need to talk about the invisible labor that is behind it, because we cannot have a human rights approach to AI if we don't talk about the humans that make it up. And it is often deliberately designed in a way that these kinds of like data sweatshops are located outside of the jurisdictions in which these companies are located. So, for example, there's been after GPT was really praised for not being as toxic of a chat box as, you know, other previous versions. And a lot of work had gone into sort of training these data sets not to be, you know, discriminatory, racist, sexist. But that work to make it less toxic was actually coming from below minimum wage paid workers, sort of in Kenya. There are people in Argentina. We know that they're often, even within these countries, marginalized migrants who are doing this work, because it's completely outside, like people taking it up are obviously people who are not part of the formal economy or able to do full-time jobs. And that is very important, that it sort of is created this kind of global underclass that performs this content moderation, that doesn't then have a say or a seat at the table when we're talking about regulation, but is often sort of makes up what we call AI. So I think sort of talking about that labor is very important. And I think not just that, I think there's a lot of, and that's where like sort of, I think feminist approaches to labor really teach us that, you know, any grand model of things is often made up of a lot of people doing unpaid labor. And there are a lot of academics who have talked about how people who are, for example, you know, generating content on platforms are often the ones training these models in order to become better. For example, a lot of these platforms that we use are good because so many people are using them at scale. Google would not be such a good search engine if so many people were not using it. So it's our labor, our unwaged labor, that is also training these models, these algorithms, to become better. And there's no really sort of calculus of that. So Spotify has really good recommendations because it is a platform that is operating at scale, and that is something that also doesn't really figure into conversations around regulation of AI or human rights approaches of AI, because what these regulations do pretty much is that they operate within this capitalist model that already exists and accept it as this kind of framing that there will be a certain level of exploitation of data, of labor that is built into this model, and we will think the regulation will be then within this model. So it's not going to challenge these kind of foundational exploitative practices around AI. And that becomes really questionable when we talk about, some of this regulation. I'm going to talk about very briefly the AI Act. It's impossible to give it justice in this small amount of time, but I just wanted to sort of foreground that, if these discussions are not being talked about, it is reflective of the fact that the people in the room making these legislations and this regulation are people who are not really touched by these issues. They're not the ones who are working to at a $2 per hour rate in order to make ends meet. There are people who are operating directly with the companies and sort of operating at a very different level of economics, at a very different level of privilege. As everybody, I think, before me has constantly sort of said, and so I won't harp upon this for very long, that AI is not neutral, nor is it always beneficial. And I think that's something that has now, at least, become the starting point for a lot of the regulation that is being proposed. So the language in the EU AI Act is about high risk AI, what that sort of means. So it is sort of conceding that certain kinds of algorithmic sort of technologies are obviously not there, and there's some applications to of AI to things like job applications, policing, sort of determining welfare, that can lead to large-scale discrimination and present a high risk. So it's going to sort of accommodate it accordingly. And now we're also, as the speaker before me was also talking about, how disinformation at scale is a very big issue and how AI can really feed into how this is generated. So I think going to sort of the third part of, and perhaps the most important, for where I'm guessing a lot of the questions after this, and guessing where the first panel ended, is about what do we do and how do we go on from here. So before all this like sort of specific legislation on AI, what we really saw was that the data protection law was doing a lot of the laws around the world, and the GDPR in particular was doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of how do we regulate data and data justice in terms of AI. And while there is specific language around automated decision making when it comes to use of personal data, it really talks about profiling and that kind of very direct discrimination. But even that language is very vague. It doesn't really speak to the complex ways in which AI is operating, and simple consent requirements don't really address the larger issue that sort of we talk about, which is actually discrimination, which is sort of data reflecting these kind of real life harms. And it of a lot of the risk mitigation measures or sort of audits and things like that were voluntary within the GDPR scheme, which sort of set the goal template for other data protection laws across the world. And I think something to also talk about, I think something that the GDPR approach, while it says that it has a data minimization as a core principle, when we talk about fairer AI, we want to feed more data sets into it in order to make it more representative. So where does that sort of lie in, it could lead to actually further marginalization of people if we're going to minimize data, because the minimized data is much more likely to represent sort of mainstream or like sort of majority populations. So this is the kind of a risk-based approach that the AI Act has taken, and sort of I'll conclude on this as well, where there's some certain practices that are completely deemed as prohibited, which is a completely unacceptable risk. Where a lot of the work happens is regulated high-risk AI systems, where the risk is deemed to be quite high. That's where policing, that's where, you know, all of the discussions around job applications, dealing with matters of migration, that's where they lie. And I think that also sort of who gets to determine what the risk is, because the promise of the AI Act and even the DSA is that if in Europe we are able to regulate these companies, then it'll have a trickle-down effect in the rest of the world. But who gets to define these risks? And so the agenda will be again set by regulators under the EU Act, whereas the rest of the world doesn't really get to hold these companies accountable. For example, with the kind of harms that have actually occurred in, for example, a place like Myanmar, where, you know, hate speech was rampant on Meta's platforms and sort of contributed to complete dehumanization and genocide of the Rohingya people. That's not something that's going to, you know, be on top of the list when we're talking about harms. It's going to be determined by the people who are sort of regulated by the act. So I think it sort of creates this kind of creates this kind of danger where dangerous AI or harmful AI that is considered high risk or prohibited in the EU could then be funneled into the rest of the world where that is completely unregulated. And the kind of power that the rest of the countries have, I'll just take one extra minute, the almost absence of power in the rest of the world. You don't really get to hold these tech companies accountable. I've been in rooms with these tech companies where you're literally sort of pointing towards cases where you know that there are direct threats that can, you know, get someone killed. Apart from that, I feel like people from the global south don't even bother approaching these tech companies, but they're not going to take it down, or they're not going to tweak their algorithms in order to discourage that kind of that harmful content. So I think when we talk about human rights approaches, if we do not have a calculus of actual power and where power lies and who gets to hold people accountable, if we don't have that kind of uncomfortable conversation, because while tech companies do have a lot of power, regulators also have a lot of power, and that power is not evenly distributed. And if we're going to argue for country-based sort of models where, you know, regulation is happening, then that's also something that creates a tension for authoritarian regimes, where you don't want them regulating AI as well, or you don't want to advocate for that. So I think the conversation around AI regulation needs to be further complicated, and I think the people, despite the fact that it is sort of an EU-specific regime, there has to be an understanding that this will have implications for the rest of the world, and to bring those people into those conversations and have that, because we would love to also have audits of tech companies and hold them accountable. But yeah, that just sort of, I'll just end on that note that, you know, human rights approaches like sort of can often, if they are not inclusive, if they don't have that kind of calculus of power, can be quite hollow and empty. And these tech companies are global, and that's why sort of discussions about regulation should also be truly global. So yeah, sorry if I took up 3 extra minutes.
No problem. Thank you so much. This great presentation. Everything is okay? We are continuing with our third panelist, dear Lisa Ginsborg. I just want to introduce her. Dr. Lisa Ginsborg is a researcher fellow at the European University Institute School of Transnational Governance on the European Digital Media Observatory and is a lecturer in international human rights at New York University, Florence. She has worked in a number of research and teaching positions, including at University College Dublin and the EUI-based Center of Media Pluralism and the Media Freedom in the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and the European University Center for Human Rights and Democratization, and she previously worked in the legal department of the International Secretariat of Amnesty International and in the office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she holds a PhD in Public International Law from the EUI and master degree in Political Sociology from the London School of Economics and Political Science. And the floor is yours, dear Lisa. And you have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind invitation to speak at this event. I'm very sorry to not be with you in person today. So my intervention will focus mainly on the topic of disinformation in relation to some of the issues that have already been covered, in particular in relation to the issue of transparency. This is the risk of going after such great panelists on both panels, but I will reconnect a bit to the previous panel. But in particular, I'd like to look at this topic in relation to disinformation, as this is the main focus of the European Digital Media Observatory, EDMO, where I work. Just a couple of words about EDMO. EDMO is a platform bringing together stakeholders to combat disinformation in the EU. And its main approach is grounded in the idea that any long-term solution to disinformation requires building societal resilience against disinformation by strengthening the ability of society to better understand and discern disinformation, strengthening quality journalism, media literacy, fact-checking, and research. So in the context of the fight against disinformation, AI has become, of course, an increasingly important topic in the EU, including in the regulatory sphere, as we've just heard from our previous speaker, but also in the context of the Digital Services Act and the Code of Practice on online disinformation. So in particular, I'd like to address three areas in relation to algorithmic design and disinformation, and their implications for human rights. So the first is in relation to algorithmic design of online platforms and their role in giving prominence to disinformation. This, of course, we've heard a lot about already in the previous panel. There are numerous studies which raise questions about the human rights implications of harmful algorithmic design. We've heard also from Sarah Eagan about this. And of course, one of the widespread criticisms of online platforms has been precisely in relation to the expectation that engagement-focused ranking systems will amplify harmful content, including disinformation. So this has, of course, a number of implications in relation to human rights, including, for instance, what we saw in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic for the right to health, the right to free and fair elections, but also the right to information more generally. And as we know well, large social media platforms are very secretive about their algorithms, reveal very little about their inner workings, but increased transparency over algorithmic ranking systems, I would argue, is one of the urgent areas where we need more transparency. What is the organizing principle of these algorithms? What are they optimizing for? Is it engagement? Is it time spent on a surface? Is it content quality? Is it clicks? Is it something else? what does each algorithm in the interlocking set optimize for, and what is the system as a whole optimizing for? So this is the first area where transparency is urgently needed. The second area is closely linked, but has to do with algorithmic content moderation. So social media companies have been increasingly using complex algorithms and automated systems to rid their platforms of disinformation and other harmful content. The newly released transparency reports under the Digital Services Act give us a bit of a sense of the scale of this. So for instance, on Instagram, 98.4% of the 76.3 million pieces of content that were removed from April 25 to September 30 this year were done so via automation. So as it was reported also by Politico a few days ago, it becomes obvious from these numbers that in a few years, these levels of AI-aided content moderation will become ever more sophisticated and will perhaps in the end up replacing many of the people working on this content moderation, which may or not be a good thing, also based on what we heard from our previous speaker, given the conditions of some of this job. But it also gives more power to this black box AI systems where human moderation does not play a part in this. And there doesn't seem to be much depth in the reports of how this works. And there's an urgent need here too to understand more about also the human rights implications and risks, as we heard also from our first panelist, are clear in the context of content moderation, especially in regard to the principle of freedom of expression. So while strong content moderation may be desirable in certain contexts, in others, especially with more fragile civil society and freedom of expression, media may be highly problematic and dangerous. So while there are some requirements under recent EU legislative instruments surrounding disinformation and illegal content, the reporting by platforms still remains somewhat limited. So for instance, the strengthened code of practice on online disinformation, which is an EU self-regulatory instrument, so which the main online platforms and many others have signed up to, and was adopted in its strengthened form in 2022, has a number of commitments, including the commitment that signatories will report on their policies and actions to ensure that the algorithms used for detection, moderation, and sanctioning of impermissible conduct and content on their services are trustworthy, respect the rights of end users, and do not constitute prohibited manipulative practices. So, of course, there is a concern for how this is done and transparency around this and the human rights implications, also in the Digital Services Act. But when we look at the first reports concerning content moderation, the transparency remains quite limited. Although platforms are reporting on the content moderated, it doesn't really give us a full picture of how decisions are made and how this relates to the broader online information environment. So these are two areas. The third area I wanted to address in relation to disinformation is the growing anxiety about the effects of AI, and in particular the new wave of generative AI on spreading disinformation. We've also heard a bit about this. Of course, the opportunities are abundant for producing content at large scale, which is auto-generated, inauthentic, and false. So the risks for disinformation are huge. And here too, transparency appears to be a central issue in which there's an urgent need, not only for transparency to better understand the disinformation flows, but also to adequately inform the policy responses. But also, in order to develop effective tools to counter such disinformation, for instance, through automated fact-checking tools, there is an urgent need for access to platform data to be able to understand and develop tools for automated detection of disinformation. So here too, it's important to recognize that there are both promises and perils of AI in this context, and it may be a double-edged sword. We see that disinformation spreaders and those that are trying to tackle disinformation are often caught in this endless cat and mouse chase, trying to catch up on increasingly using advanced AI technologies. So in general, very much in line with the previous panel, I would argue that the issue that's most pressing in this context in Europe, but I would say also globally, is the question of transparency. And the policy responses that are being developed, perhaps with little understanding of the information environment as a whole and how policies may affect it. So in this context, Europe is making some significant progress in pushing for transparency from large platforms, as we heard also from the first panel. And research and civil society access to data about social media platforms has become perhaps one of the primary way policymakers, the public and advertisers can gain an increased understanding of the information environment. So the European policy response has increasingly recognized the fundamental role to be played by independent scientific research in this field. And as many of you probably know, the regulatory instruments themselves include a number of provisions allowing or trying to enable access to data for research purposes. So the strengthened code of practice on disinformation, which I mentioned, includes a provision on access to continuous real-time or near real-time, searchable, stable access to non-personal data, and anonymized, aggregated, or manifestly made public data for research purposes through automated means such as APIs. And the DSA contains a similar provision. And as some of you may know, this is distinguished in two parts in Article 40 of the DSA, addressing on one hand the more private, sensitive data, which raises concerns under GDPR, but also the more public data. So providers of very online platforms are expected to give access without undue delay to data, including where technically possible, to real-time data, provided that the data is publicly accessible. So public data should be made accessible by platforms according to recent EU legislation, including the Digital Services Act. So these are two key areas in regulation. In relation to this, many platforms have started to set up mechanisms to allow real-time access to data for researchers. Now, this is an important area. Why? Researchers can play multiple roles here. They can play a key role to, of course, understand the spread of this information, but they are also called in to assess the role performed by platform in content prioritization and moderation, auditing algorithms, understanding the implications of online content moderation practices and the implementation. But also, some have argued that actually they may even be called in to assess the transparency efforts under the legal instruments themselves, like the DSA. Some argue that researchers may become the new auditors. Of course, they shouldn't be, but they can provide an independent check, not only on the platform self-assessment, but also on the independent audits themselves. So many different roles to be played by independent research in the area of transparency. And as we've seen, many platforms have started to provide or to create, some faster than others, new APIs to allow access to data for research purposes. Perhaps with the most notable exception of Twitter X, which actually started charging researchers for access to data and has since left the code of practice. But the other main online platforms have started either revamping or developing new APIs for researchers to fulfill these requirements. So a number of questions remain here, which I think are relevant to the panel, but also to the audience in the room, perhaps. First of all, will these systems be sufficient to allow meaningful insight to researchers in terms of the types of data they provide? Will they shed light also into questions of algorithmic design, content moderation, and their impact on human rights? Will they be built fast enough to cope with the new wave of generative AI and allow counter tools to be built in time in this race with many important elections coming up in 2024? Will the programs and tools developed be opened up beyond academic research to allow also access to other stakeholders like civil society, fact checkers, and potentially even journalists? And finally, perhaps most interesting for this audience is also related to the questions of the previous panelists. Will the tools built in response to the EU legal instruments also expand to include researchers and data from social media users outside Europe? So will there be an expansion of these tools beyond Europe, or will there be some kind of impact of EU regulation on platform transparency, which will have a meaningful effect beyond Europe? So I think my time is up, but I'm happy to talk about this more in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And now we are continuing with the questions, and I think the questions can be in Turkish and English. We can translate it. I have two questions for the panelists, but we can continue my questions. Okay, thank you so much. Well, first of all, with Shmyla, we know that many steps have been taken to regulate AI systems in the world, from the US, the European Union, and we know that Biden has just signed an executive order addressing AI, and European Union discusses the draft AI Act. And also we know that these rules, binding or non-binding rules, address the principles like transparency, equality, non-discrimination, safety. And I just wonder, how do you evaluate the challenges to implement these principles into regulations? Binding rules or non-binding rules, not important. What's the challenges according to you?
I think that it's an important conversation to have, because sometimes sort of the blunt instrument of the law, especially when it comes to speech and content aspects, having any kind of regulation runs into a kind of free speech issue, which is very important. I think I have yet to see a very, very good regulation on content moderation, and content moderation also with relation to automated content moderation, that can truly account for the complex ways in which speech occurs, and also sort of the global nature of it, in which it becomes very, very diverse, in which it becomes much more contextual. So I think somebody in the a question in the last panel was, we have agreed to a certain extent that violent content should not be allowed on these platforms, but when it comes to sort of witnessing violence or human rights violations, then it comes in. So it's so complex and sort of case to case. So I think regulation in terms of design, and regulation that allows for that is binding, that allows for transparency, I think is the way to go, rather than getting at directly to the speech. If we look at the system and how to improve that kind of system through binding mechanisms, I think that's the best way to go about it, because I think other attempts at regulating speech are very clumsy a lot of the time. And I do agree with Lisa as well, like sort of transparency is perhaps most important, because that is what the way that tech companies operate, there's a lot of obfuscation, both in terms of their design, how it is implemented, and also when those harms occur, there's also this kind of entire machinery that comes into play in order to disprove whether that really happened, and to effectively gaslight people who have been researching and documenting on it. So I think for them to open up as much as possible, and I think for that we need binding rules, just because these companies are not going to do it voluntarily. The kind of power that they hold and the people trying to hold them accountable, there's such a big power differential that I think it has to be some kind of binding way, and how that gets implemented, I think, is the real question. Then, where do we get that? Is it the US where most of these companies are, or the EU, which holds a lot of economic power, so companies might listen to it? That is, I think, how do we go about it is probably the more complex question. And I think, yeah, just reiterating that, we don't want to create also these kind of like different kinds of a sort of hierarchy of regulation where like certain populations enjoy more. So I think getting at like sort of when we build these binding transparency mechanisms, it's very, very important to make sure that it's something that is sort of gets at the design of how everything happens, and sort of obligates these companies to do it across the board, and to create, because I think trying to create economic incentives, trying to create other kinds of incentives is not really working, because it's just they've become so powerful. I think maybe early interventions might have been better, but the kind of like beast that we've created, I think it has to be binding. But if for directly regulating speech, I wouldn't probably be in favor of that. That's an entirely different discussion, because it has a lot of complex, sort of contextual issues, a lot going on. And I think sort of speech regulation at scale is very, like, I wouldn't trust these companies with it.
Thank you so much. My last question is to Lisa. We face hate speech on social media, and there is no exact definition of hate speech. And my question is, do you think what are possible ways to identify disinformation and harmful content on social media, and what are the possible or current problems for the social media users about this issue?
Okay, thank you. So this is a complex question with many different elements to it, but I will give it a go. So just to say that, as I mentioned at EDMO, we look at disinformation, but what we've seen increasingly is, well, when we started off, there was this clear distinction between kind of what is legal and what is illegal, and disinformation was seen to often fall in the legal category, in the sense that it was everything that was not illegal but still harmful, so done with an intent to harm and so on, but was in this more legal category. The distinction is not always so clear, and often hate speech and disinformation go together. So it's not often there are instances where disinformation is also illegal. So of course, these categories are very difficult to separate and keep apart. Often disinformation goes with a series of other illegal behaviors. So having said that, we have a clear definition of disinformation, which is that the intent to spread this with the element of intent, which distinguishes it from misinformation. But at the same time, especially with a number of events, but also in the context of the war in Ukraine and more recent events, we see that, I mean, it's very difficult to separate the grounds in all of this. Having said that, it doesn't really matter from a certain point of view, in the sense that the approach that you're mentioning is how to equip the user to distinguish and so on. Of course, there's the content moderation side, which would be activated in case of illegal behavior, especially now with the DSA coming into place in the EU. But with respect to the question of how to equip users to distinguish, I guess, disinformation and also hate speech, we have this approach, which I think is also reflected in the code of practice on disinformation, that there are many different avenues and different parts of society need to be empowered in different ways. And one of the key areas of EDMO activity is media literacy, so trying to educate towards being able to either discern disinformation or educate in schools, or kind of have this critical approach. Of course, there are risks here with the dangers of undermining trust in reliable media. So there has to be this fine line between pushing for critical approaches, but at the same time not undermining trust in media, trust in society as a whole, trust in news. So in this sense, how possible ways to help society identify disinformation, definitely this. EDMO has a network of fact checkers who operate across Europe and share information on their fact checking content. This is normally in the case when it is not illegal behavior. This would be a label, of course, that then would be featured on next to the story or simply on the fact checker's webpage, but trying to give a context to the disinformation story, why it was fact checked and so on. So to kind of provide information to the public to be able to make their own judgment on whether something is true or false. Aside from this, we always push for increased research to try and understand how disinformation spreads, what are its avenues, what kind of policy responses may be useful, and so on. I hope this answers your question. That was more about the user, but I'm not sure if I captured it in relation to the hate speech dimension.
So much for your great answer. And continue in Turkish for the translation to Lisa and other participants. Pardon.
One point that most people are curious of is the legal dimension of it. In the previous panel, we've talked about the technical aspects, but in the second panel, we touched upon legal dimensions and aspects of it. And I wonder if you have any questions about it. And Mr. Gökhan, Professor Gökhan, I am representing him, and maybe I could address the questions that are mostly posed to him.
About these legal issues, please. Yeah.
So thank you for your talks. Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of insight on how to create a regulatory framework and how we counter hate speech and disinformation. But maybe this is me being a bit cynical and I guess a bit of an activist. I'm really worried about the enforcement side of this, because oftentimes we often see, reports in the media or, on social media, Meta was fined this much for breaking this rule, or now X was fined this much for breaking that rule. But it's often a very, very tiny fraction of the profits they make from spreading this much hate and this much disinformation. So I know this is a bit off topic and this a bit of a stretch, but I'm wondering, especially in the light of the coming European elections, what can the EU do about this, and maybe what can the rest of the world do about this, the enforcement side? Because I guess we need to hit them in the pocket, but that's not really happening.
Well, if you want, we can begin with you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good question. I think, but again, regulation, sort of what I also mentioned was, and I truly think this is something that we need to talk more about, is that regulation operates within this kind of economic model where we have accepted that these companies have the power that they have amassed and the kind of exploitation models that they have built this power on should be kept intact, and we just need to sort of the rough edges need to be smooth, and then everything will be okay. Fundamentally, I think regulation needs to grapple with the sheer power of these companies, and I think that's something that perhaps this kind of regulation isn't equipped to do. There are conversations, for example, in the US about, sort of just breaking up some of these companies. Should they be able to acquire other platforms? Should they be able to completely have a stronghold over the information landscape? Should three companies just be dictating, 3 or 4 companies be dictating the kind of content that we consume? I think that's a very important conversation. Perhaps, I don't know if that's what your question was addressing, but I think the current regulation isn't equipped to do that, and that would require a larger conversation. And I think even when we talk about, like, for example, data protection, it doesn't get at the exploitation, that is sort of the ways in which data is being profited off. It's, again, sort of just trying to operate within that kind of larger capitalist model. So I think questioning that is perhaps the most important. We'll keep trying to sort of play this kind of game. Now disinformation is a problem, let's have regulation for that. When that doesn't get fixed, there'll be like another trend, and then we'll just be doing that, and without really addressing how these companies have acquired so much power and why we have allowed them to acquire so much power and thus so much influence. So I think I definitely think that that is the way to go, and to fundamentally then also be okay with imagining a very different kind of internet where there wouldn't be these kind of centralized platforms is important. But yeah, I don't see that in any of these regulatory discussions. I don't know if Lisa wants to come.
Thank you so much. And lastly, dear Lisa, would you like to add some things about it?
Sure, maybe just to say that at least in the EU, I guess we're all watching to see what will happen, because the DSA, so the Digital Services Act, which is of course brand new and hasn't been really applied yet, but it does have this promise that it can apply fines up to 6% of the worldwide annual turnover of the platform. So this is a significant fine if this was to happen. But of course, it remains to be seen in cases of breaches of the DSA obligations. But this is all new. So I would say we don't really know how this will work in practice and what kind of breaches and how this will be applied. So I guess we're all waiting curiously to see, as of course there are already instances of problematic cases. For instance, the case of Twitter X that already left the code of practice, which, although it is a self-regulatory instrument, can become a co-regulatory instrument in the context of the DSA. So I guess my short answer would be let's see if anything is changing with the DSA, because that's the hope in Europe, that it will have more enforcement power.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. And personally, I just can say that for Turkey, the problem is that we don't respect the rule of law. We have rules, we have regulations, but we don't want to apply for them, or we just don't want to use them. The main problem is we don't respect the rule of law. And yes, in the end, I thank the Hrant Dink Foundation for this great organization, and dear panelists, Shmyla and Lisa and Gökhan Ahi, and this great participants. And I hope we can meet each other in other organizations. Thank you so much.
Thank you.